one of the big commitments that we have at the Max Bell School is to try to foster discussions around public policy that are local, national, and global. And so when we were having our early discussions around this particular meeting on climate at a crossroads, and given the kinds of discussions we've been having at previous eco-fiscal conferences, we really wanted to make sure that as part of the discussion, we tried to take ourselves out of our own Canada bubble. We tend to think we're the only ones experiencing a set of issues. We already learned this morning, I think really helpfully from Catherine Harrison, about how to think about these issues in comparative perspective, which is something that researchers can help us do so well, is to put our own cities, our own provinces, our own country in comparative perspective in terms of different policy approaches. So we're going to, in this last discussion, take it up one more level and look at climate information integrity as a global problem, as a global priority. And we're so pleased to have with us for this final conversation someone who can help us to really unpack the reality that climate disinformation knows no borders. So Charlotte Scaddan is the Senior Advisor on Information Integrity in the United Nations Global Communications Unit. And so she and I are going to speak for 35, 40 minutes tops in conversation about transnational disinformation campaigns, how those are affecting global climate action, how international institutions can respond effectively to this challenge in a context where, as we know, international institutions have played a role, not necessarily the only role or the most important role, but a key role in creating a framework for action, cooperative action on climate change. So I want to welcome Charlotte to Ottawa, to our conversation today on climate at a crossroads. So one of the things I'd like to start with is something that Charlotte has been involved in, which is the Global Integrity Initiative on climate change. And perhaps we can just start, Charlotte, by hearing from you how this is an initiative aimed at strengthening global climate change action and global information integrity at the same time.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. And I was actually just saying that I've been traveling around the world a lot over the past several months, going to different events talking about climate disinformation and other risks in the information ecosystem. And the conversations we've had here today have been really high quality, I would say. And I'm really, it's a treat for me to actually be able to talk about this at length. And I want to expand on some of the points we've heard. But I think it's useful maybe to take a little step back, especially at the global level at which I work, to just explain how we see the information ecosystem and then how this Global Initiative for Information Integrity on climate change came about. So, there's been, I think, I call it an awakening, but, it's been this realization that's happened over the past few years. But it's only intensified amongst the UN leadership. The Secretary General was very visionary, actually, in understanding what we call information risks, and I'll explain that later, and its impact on the UN's work. But also on our member states, on the 193 countries that are members of the UN, and other stakeholders, that we're not going to be able to achieve our internationally agreed climate goals, but actually more broadly our global progress more generally, unless we take some steps to strengthen the information ecosystem. And we've heard about a lot of what we call information risks earlier today. So they are disinformation, they are hate speech, it is the demise of free and independent media, censorship, lack of media freedom, risks around emerging tech, especially AI, polarizing echo chambers. It's all of it, and we need to address all of it if we're going to be able to move forward. So the Secretary General asked us to come up with a framework for action, which we did after a global consultation process, and that became the UN Global Principles for Information Integrity. They were launched just over a year ago. And they're really our framework for how we can have a safer, more humane information ecosystem, and contain recommendations for stakeholders pretty much across the board. So governments, tech companies, for what it's worth, if they'll listen, I'll come to that maybe later, media, civil society, and ourselves at the UN, what we can do to step up action. So that was then, that was launched last summer, and then a year ago at the UN General Assembly, member states adopted the Pact for the Future, which includes a global digital compact, which has in it an entire section on information integrity. Now, I think 2 years ago, if you'd asked me if that was going to be the case and if that was going to be possible, I would have said no. So it shows you how quickly this realization has happened and how much information integrity has really gained prominence on the international agenda. We just had the General Assembly in New York, and I went to more and spoke at more information integrity events than I would have thought possible. One of the key actions that everyone pretty much agrees that we need is what we, multi-stakeholder coalitions, which is a very UN term, and I hate it actually, but it's annoyingly accurate because, we really do need all hands on deck. And a really good example is around climate. So the global initiative was launched by the government of Brazil, ourselves and UNESCO on the margins of the G20 Leaders Summit in November. We have several countries involved, a lot of very active civil society partners, some of whom are here, media, some private sector, and others. And the idea is that, we need to, there's kind of three, I guess, strategic objectives. One is we need better research around climate information integrity. So, we need to understand what's happening in the information ecosystems around the world in languages other than English and in the global south. Most of the research, the vast majority of it is in English, and it's around, the global north and a handful of other countries. So that's one, is strengthening research and protecting researchers. We also need to look at strategic action, examples of good action that can be scaled up and adapted across geographic contexts. Now, we've heard some really good examples here today, actually. All of those local community initiatives in the last panel that were being discussed, they are things that, I could tell you are happening in different countries around the world in slightly different forms. But, we need more evidence-based to see really what's working and then to scale that up. And, just to echo the point about funding earlier, we need more funding. So we have established a global fund for the initiative to try and support some of those projects. And then we also need to make sure information integrity is recognized in international climate governance frameworks. So a big focus for us is getting information integrity into the COP process. So it's been added to the COP action agenda for the first time ever. It's it's the action 30 of 30, so it shows you what an emerging issue this is, which is great, and it means that in Belém next month, there are going to be many information integrity events, and it's going to be very prominent, but we need it to be recognized in the outcome of COP so that we can take it beyond COP 30, because we really do feel and know, based on all the research we do have, that information integrity has to be a core part of climate action, right? It can't just be something that, is kind of an add-on. If we don't strengthen the information ecosystem, we really are not going to be able to make progress on climate change. So that's how the initiative was born, and I have to say the response has been so heartening since we launched. I think it's been very interesting, actually, because we've kind of married the nascent information integrity movement, which is still fairly young, with the very, well-established environmental climate movement. But I think we've tapped into what civil society and others have recognized for some time, which is, the combination of these two crises, the crisis in our information ecosystem and the climate crisis, and how we need to address them together.
Thanks for that. And it's interesting what you said, Charlotte, about the Global South, and we know we have some watchers of this event today, since it's being live streamed from around the world, and a really important piece for us to think about in terms of engaging on an initiative like this. I wanted to just ask you about the impact of disinformation, climate disinformation particularly, on a global scale, in terms of limiting what the UN, in terms of its convening power, its standard-setting power, has been. And I ask this because, you know, we've talked about populism today in different sessions and the challenge that it creates. And one of the things I try to discuss with my students, because I teach a class on global policy at the Max Bell School, is how populism has also had a huge impact on international cooperation. Because one of the key planks of the populist playbook has been to scapegoat international organizations. Those very far away from us are handing down policy frameworks that don't acknowledge our national context, infringing on our sovereignty. We saw this, of course, in a public health context. But in a populist world and an increasingly nationalist world, and I don't think those two are necessarily the same thing, an organization like the United Nations struggles. And I just wondered if you can share with us, we've had lots of discussion around how this is operating in our communities and in our country. How is this affecting the UN's role on climate change?
It's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it going a little beyond climate, actually, because
it affects other mandates.
Absolutely, but we do see commonalities there. I do want to say one thing at the outset. You know, we talk about information integrity, and I mentioned some of the information risks that that we see. There's been quite a bit of discussion today about labeling, right? Disinformation, misinformation, hate speech. You know, look, it's important to know what we're talking about here. But I will say that you need to look at the behaviors and the actors and not necessarily the content, right? And that is really key because we see commonalities in the behaviors of different adversarial actors, regardless of the narrative that they're putting out. And, you know, we also need to look at, you know, the sources, right, where this is coming from in order to be able to respond to it effectively. And, you know, when you're really focusing in on, you know, what is true, what is not, what is disinformation, what is not, I think that you are kind of missing an opportunity to look at, it's about how the information's spreading and why it's effective and why people are responding well to it. And you just, you know, talked about the populism there and what is it about, that people are reacting to. And for me, this really cuts across climate, all different issue areas. You know, in my job, I work on information integrity more broadly. I spend a lot of time talking about climate in recent months, but I also go to, you know, events and we look at issues around peacekeeping. We look at issues around different conflict and crisis situations. You have to look no further than what's been happening in the Middle East for the past couple of years to see an absolute crisis in the information ecosystem around that conflict. We look at gender. We look at, frankly, the whole spectrum of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We look, which have themselves become the focus of a conspiracy theory. And I actually don't know if you know, but this is an SDG pin. It has the 17 SDG colors. This pin is actually, in a lot of places, I have colleagues who will not wear this pin anymore because it's part of a conspiracy theory that signifies that you're part of the global cabal that is basically taking over the world. So, you know, this is, you know, but like, and I know it sounds crazy, but this is real, right? So it impacts elections, it impacts other things. But you hit on something really important, which is that one commonality we see across all of these different issue areas is this idea that there is an elite speaking its own language, that it's opaque, that it's working to undermine the interests of regular people. And that could be through climate policy, it could be through a whole host of other policies that we want to ensure global progress, like across the SDGs. And I think once you understand that, it does make it a bit easier to address it, quite frankly. Catherine McKenna said something earlier which really resonated with me, actually. She talked about she mentioned how, which, by the way, that was a very feisty panel, and I thought Canadians were really nice to each other all the time, but I was like...
it was nice disagreement.
No, it was nice. No, but it was interesting. But, you know, I learned a lot about Canada, actually, this morning. But it's very interesting to me because no matter who I speak to around the world, whatever country they're in, we do see these common threads. She said something interesting, which was about how in the environmental movement, you know, that sometimes environmentalists are not necessarily speaking the same language as regular people, you know, in terms of communications. I've been at the UN for 20 years. This was my 20th General Assembly that I just did. I consider myself an expert in UN speak and UN processes and bureaucracy. But these last several months, when I've been more involved in the climate space, and I've been going to these climate meetings, and I was at the intersessional in Bonn in June, I have no idea what anyone's talking about half the time. And that's me, right? I'm an expert on information integrity that works at the UN, has worked there for decades. So frankly, if I'm not understanding, we don't have a hope that anyone else is really knowing what we're talking about. No wonder the adversarial actors out there, no wonder they are able to very convincingly tell people that we are doing secretive stuff and that we're not transparent and that we're speaking our own language and that we're not working in their best interest because we don't speak that language. So, I mean, look, I'm not laying the blame all on us, right? There are many structural obstacles that, I'm sure we'll come to, including in the digital space that were touched on earlier. But I think once you understand those behaviors and the commonalities across those behaviors, it does make it a bit easier to process how we can then start to take measures to address it. But to answer your question, this is impacting all of the UN's work, right? All of the UN's work across the world. So it's climate, but it's every issue, and they all intersect with each other.
Yes, and I think one of the key pieces that it's probably affected is belief in or acceptance of agreements that are reached internationally. And even though those agreements are done through negotiation and they involve sovereign governments, there's a narrative that these are somehow imposed against the interests of states. So really interesting to hear you on this. I do want to get into technology questions a little bit with you. So we talked about this a little bit this morning, that when we think about generative AI in particular, it's not just about amplifying misinformation. We're also in a world where it can begin to generate that information. And so for you, Charlotte, what mechanisms or international norms do you think are most urgently needed to ensure AI systems are transparent and aligned with these informational integrity principles? In the Digital Compact, we hear a little bit about this as well, as you mentioned. What do you think we need in this very quickly moving landscape?
Yeah, and this was touched on in the previous panel. I mean, everywhere I go now, people are talking about AI and Gen AI with alarm and concern. And, I think that they are right to be alarmed and concerned because the risks are huge and we don't even really know what those risks are. And for me, I think that the biggest issue is the general undermining of trust in any information, because people at this point don't really know. They just don't know what to believe. They don't know what's real and what's not. I mean, these tools are being rolled out at breakneck speed, right? Especially in a lot of countries, but they're not reliable at all. And it's just reinforcing that sense of that we don't have a shared reality and we don't know what's true. I do think it's important to remember and not to anthropomorphize these AI models, because humans are deploying these models, humans are developing these models, and humans can decide to have trust and safety by design, to have transparency, to have independent audits, to have safe harbor for researchers. Humans can do all those things. That's not what's happening, though. What's happening is that we've got a small group of humans who are putting profit above all risk and, are kind of, it's almost tech for tech's sake, and constantly putting forward this argument, this false dichotomy of innovation versus safety. And you hear it again and again and again. But safety enables innovation, right? So I think it's very important that we as a society push back on that argument. And I don't hear it being done enough. I think it's important that we empower citizens who are really worried about this to be able to push back, give them the tools that they need to explain their concerns. And frankly, we obviously need governance. Now, at the UN, we have the scientific panel that's that's being launched, and nominations for that are ongoing, and the global dialogue on AI governance. These are really important fora, partly because they are, I think, the only place really where you have these inclusive discussions, and where voices from the global South and those marginalized and those who are feeling the impacts of information harms can actually be represented. But of course, as I said, unfortunately, we have a few players who have a lot of power here. So for me, we need urgent AI literacy, but we also need people to understand what the risks are around these tools and be able to use their voice. And, it is really hard because, this technology is changing so quickly, but we have to be as quick.
Yes, and just a plug for Canadians in creating this, I think of it, maybe not completely accurately, but I think of it as the IPCC of AI. And it's been Canadians, including from Montreal and other places, who have been working with AI, who have helped to build this structure. Can I just turn the table slightly and get your thoughts on AI companies as climate actors? Because we know that these are technologies that require enormous amounts of energy. And we haven't yet really talked about that in our conversation today. Yes, they're shaping the information landscape, but they themselves have an incredible footprint that I think we need to discuss as well.
Well, I agree, it needs to be discussed more. And because they are climate actors. And they need to be thought of as climate actors. And this is true not just because of the environmental impacts of the deployment of AI, but also the application of AI. I mean, how is this technology being used for fossil fuel exploration and fossil fuel extraction, to scale up and amplify that? This needs to be, I think, there needs to be a lot more public awareness around this. There is not transparency around how these tools are being used. And there isn't information integrity and transparency about the environmental impact either, right? There's a lot of greenwashing around it, and there's a lot of kind of dismissing of, it's, oh, well, there are impacts, but look at all the great things that AI is going to be able to do. That it, by the way, hasn't delivered on yet. We're waiting. So I think we absolutely need to think of them that way, and that really has to be front and center in a lot of the conversations about climate action.
So I'm going to ask a few more questions, but I'm going to encourage that if any of you have questions you want to bring into the conversation, start coming to the microphone, and I'll call on you. We talked about in the last panel resilience as a theme, and we wanted to structure the conversation today at the conference around understanding the terrain of disinformation and climate, but also thinking about the different ways that we can respond. You've previously noted that, and I'm quoting you here, we are in effect guinea pigs in an information experiment that is testing our societal resilience. So what have we learned so far from this experiment? Where are we? What gives you hope, I guess, that we can adapt in time?
Hope is always the hardest question when it comes to AI, to be honest. But I think, I did say that, and I believe it, and I don't think that we are going to pass that test as it stands. But I also think that so there isn't a silver bullet here, right, in terms of resilience. And, we heard a lot of really important solutions mentioned earlier. We heard about the literacy piece, regulation, which human rights-based regulation is, regulatory mechanisms are important. We talked about media strengthening and viability, absolutely important. There are community engagement solutions, which are really key. All, research, risk assessment, response, strategic communications, all of that is really key. But when it comes to AI, as I said, this is very fast-paced, and I think we have to shift our thinking around the information landscape. I think honestly, as international organizations, and I love the UN, it's been my whole career, and but if we're honest, we're not the fastest moving when it comes to, either decision making or keeping up with new technologies, right? So we absolutely have to shift our thinking around the information landscape. And I think that has happened to a degree. There was a question earlier, and it was addressed in the last panel, but there was a question about podcasts and mainstream media. And podcasts are mainstream media now. right? Those niche information spaces, they are the mainstream now. But if you go into a lot of discussions and meetings at international organizations and other institutions, people there are still talking as though the nightly news is the mainstream, right? But it's not. And very soon, these AI tools they're already becoming the mainstream. So I think we need to really urgently reconfigure our thinking, make sure that people understand how their data is being used, try and demand a bit of empowerment. But we need to put into place all of these different measures that we've just talked about. The hope I have, honestly, comes from the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, I've been going around the world at a lot of different events. It comes from the amazing community and movement that there is around information integrity as it pertains to climate, but more broadly. I mean, really, there are so many pockets of excellent work happening out there from civil society, from media, from others. I think our role at the UN, and I see my role a lot, is trying to convene, some of these different pockets across thematic silos, across different country contexts, to make sure that we're sharing all that learning and resources and really mobilizing together. But there really is not only concern and recognition, but there's a lot of momentum. And that honestly gives me hope, because I think it's interesting with AI. It's a little bit like child online safety. If there's one thing that can really unite people across different political beliefs and across, different societies, it's their concern about what's going to happen with AI. I've heard it from so many different parts of, different groups. So I think we need to tap into that, and we need to kind of channel that so that people can demand some action.
Okay, I've got 2 more questions, and then I'll come to the audience and perhaps come back. So when we think about the UN's role, or any multilateral organization's role, it's often in coordination, finding areas of convergence and agreement. We know that global tech platforms, companies have huge reach, have huge global impact, and that the enforcement of disinformation policies and practices globally is quite uneven, the enforcement. So what leverage does an organization like the UN have to try to incentivize stronger platform accountability?
So we talk a lot about healthy incentives, actually. But so when it comes to tech companies, I think they've made their position quite clear, especially, I would say, over the last year or so, that they, when it comes to big tech, that they do not put trust and safety first. They are rolling back trust and safety. They are not living up to even their own policies, and in some cases, actually diminishing those policies around, putting user privacy and safety first. So in some cases where there are regulatory mechanisms in place, such as the EU and other places, they are having to be more transparent and do reporting. But we have to be very realistic, right, about tech engagement. And I think for a long time, there were very well-meaning efforts to engage tech around self-regulation, but perhaps I'm skeptical. But I think that we have to listen to what they're telling us, right, and what they're showing us. What we do need to do, though, is to look at other entry points for change. So this is why we have been working with advertisers a lot more. And one thing we haven't touched upon too much today is the business model of tech. I mean, we heard about monetization, right, especially as it pertains to media. But these are tech companies by name only. Really, they're advertising companies. They are advertising companies. And when you think of them as advertising companies, it really helps, or it's helped me anyway, to figure out how we can try and move them. And the way that we can try and move them is through the ad dollars that fund their business model and that fund those algorithms that are pushing out polarizing content. And so we've been working really closely with a lot of allies in the ad industry, with brands, to basically make the case that not only are their ad dollars putting their own brands at risk, because their ads are ending up next to content that they would never want, but frankly, the ad tech supply chain, which I won't get into, it's very convoluted and complex, and maybe some of you understand it, and well done if you do, but it's this complex supply chain that really is not transparent at all, where brands are throwing in millions, if not billions, and then the tech companies are placing these ads digitally and then marking their own homework by reporting back and saying this was so successful, what a great campaign. It's not necessarily translating into sales though. So we have a few emerging case studies from brands and ad industry where they actually have taken back control. They have decided, you know what, there's one case study which we're hoping to publish where the brand, it was actually the ad company working for a particular brand, reduced the number of websites that their ads were appearing on from 200,000 to 4,000. And selected websites that they wanted to support, including credible, reliable journalism and media. And therefore, they protected their brand and their sales went up. Their profits went up. So, this is a business case, right? And that's what we're making to the advertisers. So in terms of, how to move tech, that's where we're looking. We're not necessarily, they're not going to implement trust and safety by themselves. So we have to look at where we can have influence. And that could be through, in some places, human rights-based regulation. It could be through, other private sector channels. And then, of course, it's also through, consumers and users kind of demanding to know what's happening with their data.
Okay, thank you. That's a really interesting example. So let me just bring Canada into the frame here a little bit and get your thoughts. It's always interesting to ask outsiders what they think Canada is all about, but also what it should do, right? So we've taken early steps on greenwashing here, on online harms, and many of the organizations and people that we have heard from today, including researchers, are shaping international thinking on climate disinformation, on climate action. So what role do you think Canada, as a jurisdiction, that by no means is perfect, we've seen all kinds of dynamics playing out, but what kind of role could we play in advancing some of these standards on global information integrity?
Well, I think countries like Canada have a really important role to play because, we need leaders in this space. We need leading voices. We need examples that, that can be looked to, where you have convenings like this, but you also have the expertise you mentioned, and that you're pointing to solutions. And again, they could be regulatory, but the greenwashing work, for instance, is so important. And I think Canada, I know regulation-wise is still kind of in process, and it's not home to the big tech companies, but you have a very highly developed consumer base here that can. I think be a bit of a model in terms of literacy, in terms of user empowerment at the individual level. And then when it comes to climate, of course, you're very active in the climate space and in these information integrity discussions. And I mentioned at the outset that one of our goals through the global initiative was to ensure that information integrity is integrated into the COP process. So we need to look to countries who understand the information landscape and understand climate disinformation and its threats, like Canada, to help push that forward.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to a question here at the microphone. Please introduce yourself before your question.
Sure. My name's Laura Lee Bockwell, and I work with the Digital Citizenship Initiative in Canadian Heritage. We're very concerned with disinformation and digital media literacy and all of that. We are awaiting further direction. We hear a lot of testimony from people who are affected by online harms and all the negative impacts of the current information ecosystem. And given the current context of the stance of the United States government, I think there's a lot of disappointment, disillusionment, and perhaps even despair that Canada and other countries can successfully pursue the kind of information integrity policy that they would like to because of the threat of punitive measures from our closest neighbor and biggest trading partner. So my question to you is, to what extent, or do you see any strategies that Canada could engage in with like-minded countries to get into a space where they are free to regulate in the best interests of the citizens and not at the without costing more damage to the economy?
I think that there are good examples out there of countries who have managed to undertake human rights-based regulation successfully, that is focused on transparency, that is focused on freedom of expression. And I just want to reiterate something about, these arguments around free speech, as it's called in the US, or freedom of expression. And my colleague from UNESCO said this, but it is really worth bearing in mind, because we have seen what I think is kind of an attempt to invert the meaning of freedom of expression by implying that any regulatory measure or any trust and safety measure is undermining free speech. This is absolutely not the case. And in fact, you need guardrails in information spaces to enable freedom of expression so that people can express themselves, so that voices aren't silenced, but also so that people can access ideas and information of all kinds, which is precisely the meaning of freedom of expression, right? And that's not happening if you're in a polarized information landscape that's dominated by disinformation and hate. So I think it's very important that countries live up to their international commitments around freedom of expression and take all the human rights-based measures they need to ensure their citizens can access information. Obviously, I'm not naive to the geopolitical realities of the world right now, but again, I would say that there are countries taking those steps. We just saw in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, or a few weeks ago, legislation passed around kids' online safety, and that's underway now in various other countries. So I do think there, again, it's looking for those entry points for a convergence of for agreement and where publics are going to really be demanding action.
Another question here at the microphone.
And sorry, can I just say one more thing? Because they, and I meant to say this, they mentioned, the person who asked the question mentioned despair. And I hear this a lot. I speak to colleagues around the world all the time. I go to events around the world. And frankly, someone always says, I don't know what to do. I feel completely overwhelmed. What are we supposed to do in the face of these giant tech platforms, in the face of these disinformation actors who are funded by billions, right? In the face of these very powerful forces, how on earth can we have any impact? But we really can. And it starts at the local level, it starts at the community level, it starts by connecting people in different countries. You asked about Canada's role, and one thing I want to say is that what Canada can also do is take its expertise, right, and the resources that it's putting into research and other things, and connect that with countries and places that maybe don't have the means to do that, right? It's really important. It is important not to despair. And we have my team and I have a training that we do for colleagues across the world at the UN on how to strengthen information integrity in their own work. And the final slide we always have is stay optimistic, because we always feel that there's this kind of gloom and doom. But that's also a tactic of disinformation actors, right? It's to make you feel as though there's nothing you can do. But there really is. So I just do want to say that, because it can get a bit dark sometimes when you go in these spaces and you're thinking about this stuff all the time. But there are many good examples of, especially at the country level, local level, but even regionally, of really solid solutions.
Well, and we heard some of them on the last panel. About how if you challenge your assumptions and actually test them, you might find that in your interactions you get a different kind of response. So please, our next questioner.
Third time's the charm. So I guess this sort of ties into what you just mentioned of Canada's role globally, because people are usually saying countries like China and India are having a lot more emissions now. So my perspective, because I'm in engineering, I think we do have oil and gas, which is technically still cleaner than coal, and they are still relying on coal heavily. So, and every country is going to be at different points in the transition. They can't just reach renewables. There is leapfrogging, but it's not going to happen overnight. So do you think it would be better for Canada to take more of a leadership role and maybe send some of our oil and gas there to get them off the coal and use that money to transition us into renewables, and then they can follow suit after we're there, basically? Or would you not take that approach, I guess.
That is really not an information integrity question.
Sorry about
So I am not going to get into
sorry
that.
about the technical. But I meant more so as in like playing the leadership role of like sending our information and I guess the research and technology that we have overseas. Not just our natural resources in terms of oil and gas, but like we have a lot of people who have worked in the industry and stuff here. So we could share that with developing countries who are not quite at the level we're at yet. Like sharing those kinds of technical things with them more and that information.
So I'm going to not answer your question, but I'm going to answer a similar question, which is about which is about the need for research and support to countries in the global south, right? Because I mentioned it at the outset, and for us at the UN, this is really a huge priority because we do see so much of the expertise and research and funding all in, frankly, the US, EU, and a handful of other places. But just like with the impacts of climate, right, we see, there are countries on the front lines whose communities are feeling the impacts most fiercely. It's the same thing with the information landscape, right? We see, minority groups, the groups in situations of marginalization and vulnerability, who feel the impacts of online hate campaigns and other risks in the information ecosystem. But they also have the least recourse to be able to do anything about it, right? And sometimes also are the least connected, because so you have these digital campaigns targeting them, but they're not even able to understand how they're being targeted because they're not even have yet to come online. So we need more research around that, and we need to be able to support those communities better. Now, sometimes there are really good solutions at the level of those communities, but we need to understand it better and we need to scale it up. So from the UN's perspective, I have to say, this imbalance in terms of research, in terms of funding, in terms of focus, and it's a language imbalance too, is really a huge challenge. So I think, again, countries like Canada, and this is partly why we have the Global Initiative and the Global Fund, we're asking countries to give to that fund.